Get ready to dive into the Battle of Hue, one of the most intense and pivotal moments of the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. Daring strategies, deceptive tactics, and brutal combat transformed this historic city into the epicenter of a war that changed the course of a nation. Uncover the details of this battle that exposed the vulnerabilities of American and South Vietnamese forces and marked a turning point in the conflict. Welcome to American War, where history comes alive. The Tet Offensive, launched in January 1968, was one of the most audacious operations of the Vietnam War. Conceived by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, it had two main objectives: to inflict heavy casualties on American and South Vietnamese forces, and to inspire a popular uprising in the South. Planned to coincide with the Tet holiday, which traditionally marked a period of ceasefire, the offensive caught the enemy by surprise. Hue, a city rich in history and culture, was chosen as one of the primary targets. As the former imperial capital, Hue held unique strategic and symbolic value. Located near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, separating North and South Vietnam, the city was also an important logistical hub. For North Vietnam, capturing Hue meant not only a military advance but also a moral blow against the South Vietnamese government and its American allies. Defended by South Vietnamese troops and a small American contingent, Hue seemed, at first glance, to be a secondary target compared to cities like Saigon. However, that perception would quickly change. When the offensive began, the city became the epicenter of intense fighting, marking a turning point both on the battlefield and in American politics. The use of deceptive tactics by North Vietnam was a crucial element in the Tet Offensive. By proposing a ceasefire during the Lunar New Year holiday, the Communists psychologically disarmed American and South Vietnamese forces. The proposal was seen as a gesture of respect for Vietnamese traditions, but it concealed a strategy of large-scale attack. While the defenders relaxed, believing in the good faith of the agreement, the North Vietnamese mobilized troops and supplies. This maneuver exemplifies how psychological warfare can be as impactful as weapons on the battlefield. In addition to using the ceasefire as cover, the Communists intensified their logistical activities in the weeks leading up to the attack. Troop and supply movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail increased but were interpreted by the Americans as routine operations. This disinformation was carefully planned to avoid arousing suspicion. At the same time, intercepted communications were manipulated by the North Vietnamese, reinforcing the idea that the enemy was weakened. This level of sophistication in deception operations was a reflection of strategic planning in Hanoi. The psychology of the ceasefire also impacted South Vietnamese forces, many of whom received permission to visit their families during the holiday. This drastically reduced the number of soldiers available to defend important positions. The troops who remained in the cities were ill-prepared and outnumbered. This widespread absence of effective military personnel paved the way for the initial success of the communist attack. It was a vulnerability that North Vietnamese strategists exploited to the fullest. From a political point of view, the ceasefire served as a propaganda tool for North Vietnam. By proposing a temporary peace agreement and then breaking it, the Communists intended to show that the Americans and their allies were unable to protect the population. This narrative was widely exploited internally and used to justify the offensive as a necessary measure to liberate South Vietnam. Thus, the deception had both military, psychological, and political objectives. In the context of the Vietnam War, the use of deceptive tactics was not new, but the Tet ceasefire was one of the most successful maneuvers. The initial confidence of American forces contrasted with the brutality of the attack that followed. The impact was so profound that even today this strategy is studied in war colleges as an example of strategic planning. However, as we will see in the next topics, the initial success of the Communists met fierce resistance in the streets of Hue. The Communist infiltration of Hue before the attack was a brilliantly orchestrated move. Taking advantage of the intense movement during preparations for the Tet holiday, soldiers from the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army entered the city disguised as workers, merchants, and religious figures. The city, by its historical and cultural nature, had a constant flow of people which facilitated the access of troops without raising suspicion. This strategy was based on the ability to hide military strength within civilian routines, creating a silent trap. Meanwhile, weapons and supplies were carefully positioned for the imminent attack. These disguised troops used Hue's architecture to their advantage, transforming ordinary locations into strategic positions. Buddhist temples, schools, and even residences were converted into hiding places for weapons and ammunition. This process was aided by local sympathizers, who provided detailed information about the city's infrastructure and helped to hide equipment. Preparations included the installation of tunnels and secret passages, which allowed for rapid movement and protection against bombings. When the attack began, these already established positions gave the communists a significant initial advantage. For South Vietnamese forces, the presence of infiltrated enemies was a devastating shock. The defenders were not prepared to fight a force so well positioned and integrated into the urban environment. The idea that any civilian could be a disguised enemy created a climate of paranoia among the soldiers, making it difficult to make quick decisions. This also harmed the relationship with the local population, who began to be viewed with suspicion. This dynamic further reduced defensive effectiveness and helped the communists consolidate their positions. American and South Vietnamese military intelligence vastly underestimated the communists' ability to infiltrate forces into a city as central as Hue. Despite reports of movement on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and unusual activity in nearby areas, these signs were ignored or minimized. The belief that Hue was a safe city led commanders to focus their attention on other areas considered more vulnerable. This strategic error was costly at the start of the attack, when the defending forces were caught by surprise by an enemy already established within their perimeters. The infiltration of Hue also highlighted the flexibility and creativity of communist tactics. While American forces relied on firepower and large-scale operations, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army demonstrated that knowledge of the terrain and integration with the population could be equally powerful weapons. This approach challenged traditional military doctrines and redefined the way urban warfare was conducted. When the fighting began, Hue had already transformed into a communist fortress, ready to resist the counterattacks that would come. In the early morning hours of January 31, 1968, Hue was suddenly engulfed in chaos. At 3:40 a.m., rockets and mortars began to rain down on the city, indiscriminately hitting civilian and military targets. The intensity of the shelling disoriented South Vietnamese and American forces, who struggled to identify the origin of the attacks. These bombings were not only a tactic of destruction, but also a smokescreen to cover the infiltration of communist troops. As the dust settled, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces advanced in coordinated formations, quickly occupying key positions. The initial offensive was meticulously planned to neutralize the city's defenses before any effective resistance could be organized. Communist troops quickly took control of roads, bridges, and strategic buildings, cutting off communication routes between the defenders. Meanwhile, specialized units infiltrated more fortified points, using light weapons and urban guerrilla tactics. The speed and precision of the attack left South Vietnamese forces completely destabilized, allowing the communists to consolidate their positions in a few hours. The Citadel of Hue, a historic fortress surrounded by 30-meter-high walls, should have been the city's main line of defense. However, the speed and audacity of the communist troops thwarted any attempt at resistance. North Vietnamese soldiers, disguised as members of the South Vietnamese forces, opened the gates of the Citadel, allowing the 6th North Vietnamese Regiment to invade the interior. The structure of the fortress, designed to withstand traditional sieges, ended up being vulnerable in an attack that combined infiltration and surprise. The collapse of the defense in the Citadel isolated several South Vietnamese units that were trying to resist in other parts of the city. Without effective communication, and with their withdrawal routes blocked, many of these units were surrounded or forced to surrender. South Vietnamese commanders struggled to reorganize their troops, but the lack of coordination and the constant pressure of communist attacks made this task almost impossible. The numerical disadvantage and the strategic superiority of the enemy made the fight for Hue turn into a nightmare for the defenders. While the Citadel fell under communist control, the city south of the Perfume River also faced intense attacks. Street fighting began to transform Hue into a scene of destruction and despair. Historic buildings and residences were reduced to rubble as the communists consolidated their positions. However, the initial attack did not mark the end of the confrontation, but rather the beginning of weeks of brutal fighting. Hue, a culturally rich city, now became the epicenter of one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. Despite the devastating impact of the initial attack, American and South Vietnamese forces reacted quickly to establish points of resistance. The MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam Base, located south of the Perfume River, became one of the main defensive strongholds. With about 200 American soldiers and some Australian advisors, the defenders used their strategic position and knowledge of the terrain to repel repeated attacks. Improvised barricades and the use of light artillery were crucial to containing the communist advances. However, the situation was critical, as the soldiers were surrounded and faced constant attacks. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese General Ngo Quang Truong reorganized his forces in the Citadel, trying to resist the enemy siege. Elite troops, such as the Black Panther Reconnaissance Company, played an essential role in defending areas still under Allied control. These highly trained units used urban guerrilla tactics to ambush communist forces. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the defenders managed to hold some strategic positions, preventing the communists from completely controlling the city. However, casualties were severe, and supplies began to run out. With the gravity of the situation, American reinforcements were sent from the Phu Bai base, located 8 kilometers south of Hue. The Marines faced monumental challenges as they advanced through the city, including ambushes, minefields, and fierce resistance in the streets. Each corner turned into a new battlefield, with hand-to-hand combat and intense firefights. The arrival of M48 tanks helped break through some enemy lines, but the urban terrain and heavy rain limited their effectiveness. The advance was slow and costly, but essential to relieve the pressure on the isolated defenders. The fighting in the streets of Hue was especially brutal, even by the standards of the Vietnam War. American and South Vietnamese troops had to fight block by block, often under heavy bombardment. The presence of communist snipers positioned on rooftops and in tall buildings further hampered their advances. To neutralize these threats, the Allies resorted to aerial bombings and artillery strikes, which caused significant destruction to the city's infrastructure. Historical temples, schools, and residences were turned into ruins, highlighting the human and cultural cost of the conflict. The resistance of American and South Vietnamese forces at the MACV base and other strategic points was vital in preventing Hue from falling completely under communist control. However, this initial struggle marked only the beginning of weeks of intense fighting. The arrival of reinforcements created a new dynamic on the battlefield, but also brought logistical and tactical challenges. Hue increasingly became a symbol of the brutality and complexity of urban warfare, as the Allies prepared to launch larger offensives to retake the city. The Battle of Hue had a significant military impact, highlighting the limitations of American strategy in Vietnam. Although Allied forces managed to recapture the city, the high human and material cost revealed the difficulties of fighting in urban settings. The prolonged communist resistance showed that superior firepower was not enough to guarantee quick victories. Attrition among American soldiers increased, fueling doubts about the effectiveness of operations. For military leaders, Hue became a brutal reminder of the complexities of the conflict in Southeast Asia. One of the darkest aspects of the battle was the massacre of civilians conducted by communist forces. During the occupation of Hue, lists of enemies of the people were used to identify and summarily execute government officials, educators, religious figures, and others considered opposed to the communist regime. Mass graves were discovered after the city was retaken, containing the bodies of thousands of victims. Survivor accounts described scenes of extreme brutality, with entire families being murdered. This massacre highlighted the atrocities committed by both sides during the war. For the civilian population, the Battle of Hue was a catastrophe that left deep scars. Thousands of residents were killed or left homeless, while much of the city's infrastructure was destroyed. Survivors faced immense difficulties rebuilding their lives amidst the rubble. Hue, a culturally rich city, saw much of its historical heritage ruined. These events further aggravated the psychological and emotional impact of the war on the Vietnamese population, both in the north and the south. In the political arena, the consequences of the battle were even more far-reaching. In the United States, images of the destruction in Hue and accounts of the massacres shocked the public. The Tet Offensive as a whole, with the Battle of Hue as a central piece, shook the American people's confidence in the government. Protests against the war grew exponentially, fueled by a sense that the conflict was unsustainable. Politicians began to push for peace negotiations, marking the beginning of a shift in the American approach to Vietnam. Hue became a landmark in the Vietnam War, symbolizing both the brutality of the conflict and the fragility of the American position. The battle accelerated the gradual withdrawal of American troops, culminating in the Vietnamization policy led by President Richard Nixon. Although the tactical victory in Hue demonstrated the military capabilities of the Allies, the political and human consequences outweighed any strategic gain. The city remains a reminder of the complexities and horrors of war, serving as a lesson for future generations about the costs of prolonged conflicts. Now that you know the details of the Battle of Hue and how it changed the course of the Vietnam War, the question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Can the strategies and sacrifices of this battle inspire how you face your own challenges? How would you apply these lessons of planning, courage, and resilience in your daily life? If you want to continue exploring the most significant moments of American wars and learn from the mistakes and successes that shaped history, you're in the right place. Share in the comments. What was the biggest lesson you took away from this video? What other battle would you like to see covered here? Let's continue this conversation together. And before you leave, don't forget to subscribe to the American War channel and hit the bell icon to receive notifications for upcoming videos first. Here, history comes to life, and each episode brings lessons that can transform your view of the world. See you in the next video.